In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Blackflame build. This is a level 50 build. That's a strength dexterity build that focuses on the use of Blackflame. If you were using the Dragon Priest build that I made previously, you can make it into this build, or you can respec into this if you don't have the optimal stat spread, but you should be pretty fine regardless. Note that I will be showing footage from the Liurnia of the Lakes, Raya Lucaria Academy, and the Software River areas of the game, so if you don't want to be spoiled on those, then you probably don't want to watch any further. The first thing you're going to need is the Godslayer's Seal. This is found in Stormvale Castle, and this boosts Godslayer incantations, which both Blackflame and Blackflame Blade are. Right next to this as well, you can find the prayer book that you can turn into either Muriel or Korhin. That will allow you to purchase Blackflame and Blackflame Blade. You're also going to need Catch Flame, which you can buy from Korhin if you don't already have, if you didn't begin the game as a prophet. And you'll also want Bloodflame Blade, which is found in Liurnia of the Lakes. Those are the 4 spells you'll need for this. Other than that, you're going to want some sort of weapon that has bleeding on it by default, intrinsically, not something that you have to put on with Ashes of War, so like the Uchigatana like I'm using in this build, or you could use like Knight Rider's Flail or Bloodhound's Fang, something like that. There are other weapons as well, but you want something that comes with bleeding on it by default, that way you can still buff the weapon. If you use something like Bloody Slash to make a random weapon have bleeding on it, you won't be able to buff that weapon with Blackflame Blade or Bloodflame Blade. So you have to use one that has bleeding on it, and it doesn't have to have bleeding. Like, this isn't a must for this build, but it really helps. Bloodflame Blade takes advantage of that by increasing the bleeding, and also it's just really good to have bleeding with this build, because when you're using Blackflame, you're kind of putting a damage over time on enemies, and you're getting that bleed buildup at the same time, which is deadly. Other than that, the talismans I like to use are the Blessed Dew Talisman, the Green Turtle Talisman, and Faithful's Canvas Talisman. And the Blessed Dew Talisman basically gives you healing over time. If you're using Bloody Slash on your weapon, which you can use with like an Uchigatana and not put the bleeding thing on it since it already has bleeding on it, you could just leave it as like dex scaling or standard scaling. This will help regenerate health over time to offset that, and also it's just really helpful. The Green Turtle Talisman is there because you use a lot of stamina, because when you buff with Blackflame Blade, the duration is very, very short, so you need to just kind of like hack away, and you need that stamina to recover quickly so that you can dodge afterward or get some more attacks off. Faithful's Canvas Talisman is just there to boost incantation damage. It boosts it a very small amount, but every little bit helps. As far as armor goes, you can pretty much use any armor you want as long as you can mid-roll. So make sure that you can mid-roll with this build and, wear the heaviest protection that you can get. There are some specific items that boost faith, but it's very, very mild amount. You may want to try and seek those out if they're not too difficult to find. There's a list of those on the wiki under the equipment section, like special effects. I don't think you really, really need that for this build, but if it's something you want to really min-max, you'll definitely want to look out for those. So talking about how this build plays, you have Catch Flame, which is there that you've probably been using since the beginning of the game if you've been playing a faith build since the beginning, because it has very high damage even from the very beginning of the game. But it has a pretty good FP consumption. It sort of tapers off mid-game in terms of damage, but it's very, very good against enemies that, are resistant to physical damage, and you want to have it there in that case. Like enemies in the tunnels, for instance, very, very resistant to physical damage, but they die in one shot to Catch Flame most of the time. Things like spirits are very weak to fire in a lot of cases, but are very resistant to physical damage. There are specific enemies that are weak to fire, that are, strong against physical attacks, and that's what you have it there mostly for. Blackflame is there for your ranged option, to give you a ranged option with this build. It does more damage than Flame Sling, and it puts a small damage over time dot on the enemy, and the damage over time is based off the total health of the enemy. So the more health the enemy has, the more that dot's going to do. So it's going to perform better against harder enemies than it's going to do against weaker enemies, even though, you may not need the dot to kill weaker enemies. But that's how that dot works. You can also charge up this spell if you hold R1 all the way, and then it'll throw like a more damaging fireball that has kind of a smaller explosion radius. It doesn't typically hit anything else besides the target in my experience, but it does more damage, and there are circumstances when you might want to use it, like if you're trying to hit an unsuspecting enemy, might as well charge it up first and use it to get maximum damage. Blackflame Blade is an interesting ability because it gives you a weapon buff for a very short amount of time. I think it's like 6 or 7 seconds. That not only adds damage to your attacks, but it puts a dot on the enemy just like Blackflame that does a percentage of their health over a couple seconds. So the more health the enemy has, the more damage this is going to do. And what Blackflame is really, really good for, in my opinion, is two things. In co-op, when bosses have even more health, because, you know, they get more health when there are more players, that means that ability is going to do even more damage. And also in scenarios where enemies are bleed resistant or bleed immune. It helps putting damage over time on something that, you know, Bloodflame Blade isn't going to help you at all. So those are really the two scenarios that you should be using it in, and probably saving, you know, and using Bloodflame Blade in other scenarios. A lot of people get dissuaded about Blackflame Blade because it has a very short amount of time that it lasts, and it has to be recast constantly. However, it's very, very fast cast time, and if you come out of a roll or a sprint, you buff real quick. And if you get in practice of this, if you practice it like a few times, you'll get into a rhythm with it, and it's really not that hard to use in combat. And the final spell is Bloodflame Blade. This actually boosts the damage you do per swing, and also increases the amount of bleeding that you do, or bleed buildup on the enemy, I should say, with your weapon. And it can actually, you know, put this effect on weapons that don't have it, which is why you don't absolutely have to have a bleed weapon. However, if you have a weapon that has a bleed effect on it natively, it will enhance the amount of buildup you're gaining, so it'll become even more effective than it is naturally. This buff lasts much longer than Blackflame Blade, and you're going to use this against targets that can bleed. This is going to be kind of your bread and butter as you just move about levels and things like that. You're going to use this probably more often than Blackflame Blade, but Blackflame Blade is kind of your alternative when enemies can't be bled. As far as weapon skill goes, you can pretty much choose whatever you want. The main thing, again, is avoiding a blood scaling setup. Like, you can still use Bloody Slash, just make sure you set it to Keen or something like that if you're pumping Dexterity, or put it on Standard if that actually gives you more damage because you don't have a lot of Dex yet. Something like that. I really, really like Unsheath on the Uchigatana, so I keep that when I play, but sometimes, you know, maybe Bloody Slash is better for a certain enemy you're fighting or a boss that you're fighting. So swap that around as necessary, and you can play around with different weapon abilities. It's not super important which one you pick. The main attributes you want for this build are Mind, Faith, and Vigor. You need a lot of Mind because a lot of these spells cost a lot of FP. For instance, Catch Flame costs 10 FP, and Blackflame costs 11. That's quite a lot of FP, so having a lot of Mind is going to allow you to cast these spells a lot of times before needing to drink a pot. You need at least 27 Faith in order to use Godslayer Seal, so that's kind of the breakpoint you're aiming for at least with this build, but obviously the higher your Faith goes, the more beneficial it's going to be towards your spells. You're going to need some Vigor. Again, at least 20 is good because you're going to be a melee character and you will get hit from time to time. And lastly, Dexterity is there to meet the requirements of weapons and also to improve the damage they deal. For instance, I have a Keen scaling Uchigatana with B scaling at the moment, so that's going to benefit from any points I drop into Dexterity. So the more I put into Dexterity, the more damage that's going to deal. Your attribute spread for Strength and Dexterity is going to vary slightly from build to build depending on what weapon you chose to use. For instance, Bloodhound's Fang has a 18 or 17 strength requirement, so you're going to need some points into strength to use that, but it shouldn't be too many points. Moving forward, you're going to put minimum points into Vigor in order to keep your health up, and you're going to keep increasing Faith, Mind, and Dexterity. This will increase your damage throughout the course of the game. Just a couple of final tips before I wrap up this video. The Godslayer Seal uses Smithing Stone Shards to upgrade, and if you're using a weapon that uses that as well, you're going to kind of come into conflict early on about which to upgrade. I prioritize the weapon in order to get maximum damage per swing. However, if you find yourself using Blackflame more often or Catch Flame, then you may want to upgrade Godslayer Seal first. And if you need some Smithing Stone 3s, you can farm the enemies outside of Rhea Lucaria at the southern entrance there. The soldiers drop them as well as the big wheelie thing that rolls around. They have a pretty low drop rate, so you might have to be there a while, but you could theoretically farm both your weapon and your seal up to +9 if you spend a good amount of time there. And the other thing I want to mention is if you've already upgraded your finger seal, if you're using that pretty much the most of the way, or you're using some other seal, you can go ahead and use that as well. Like the Godslayer Seal isn't going to give you that much damage at this point because you're just barely going to meet the requirements to use it. And unless you have the materials to upgrade it significantly to match whatever seal you're doing, it's not going to outperform it by much. Just keep in mind that you'll probably want to upgrade that eventually. And lastly, you can use other spells with this build. This is just kind of a theme for this build, but like adding things like Blessing's Boon, which will give you a heal over time, and your group of heal over time is really good for this build. So feel free to use other spells as well, but this is kind of the general staple spells for this build. Stay tuned for more build guides. I'm going to be doing some more level 50 guides soon. I don't know exactly which one I'm going to do next. I see a lot of people clamoring for the Warrior build, the Bloodblade at level 50 to see where it goes. and some people wanting the strength build upgrade. So it's either going to be one of those two. Probably do both of those next regardless in some sort of order. So stay tuned for that.